guys, so far we have seen different data types. One is integers and one is strings. Okay, we have seen how to declare and how to initialize, how to output the values, the placeholders for all of them. Now let me introduce a term called LR parameter, or some people like call this as just a parameter. Okay, so some people like call, most of the performance testers, they would like to call this as LR parameter, or some people just call this as a parameter because this parameter belongs to LoadRunner. Some people like to call this as LR parameter. So in my class I'll be using this term LR parameter a lot. Okay, again, what is a parameter? Parameter is just like a variable, okay, but it's a different term to mention that, you know, the value inside it will be changing. Okay, so parameter is just like a variable. Parameter means something which changes all the time. The value inside that changes. But this, since this belongs to LoadRunner, we don't call that as a variable, but we call this as a parameter. Okay, so all this while these variables belongs to C, that they don't belong to LoadRunner, so we are calling this as variables, like an integer variable, string variable, boolean variable, decimal variable, or float variables. We are calling this as variables because they belong to C programming language. But here this variable belongs to LoadRunner, so they don't call this as a variable, but they are calling this as a parameter. Okay, they're calling this as a parameter. So why, when we have these variables, what is the point of a parameter? What is the point of a parameter? Okay, what can be stored in the parameter? I'll talk shortly. Like, you know, do we have different data types in parameters? No, we don't have an integer parameter, string parameter. No, we don't have a string parameter. We don't have an integer parameter. We don't have a boolean parameter. We don't have a decimal parameter. We don't have a float parameter. All we have is a parameter which can store any type of data. You can store any type of data in this parameter. You can store an integer into it, you can store a string into it, you can store a boolean into it, you can store a decimal into it, you can store a float into it, you can store anything that you want into this LR parameter. So we don't have different data types when it comes to LR parameter. Okay, but when it comes to C variables, we have so many of the data types, but when it comes to parameters, we don't have any of the data types, because we can store whatever the type of data it is, you can store that in the LR parameter. You can store that in the LR parameter. So the next question is, so Kumar, since already we have these variables, in fact, we not only have the variables, we have different types of variables depending upon the data, then why do we need a parameter for LoadRunner? And this C programming, the LoadRunner supports C programming, so you can use, when there is a need for a variable, you can use any of that. Then why do we need a special variable called LR parameter? Why do we need that? Okay, it's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. Well, the reason for that is most of the LR functions that we deal with, okay, most of the LR functions that we deal with, it could be any of the SAP GUI functions or SAP, okay, SAP GUI LR functions, okay, or web functions, okay, or web functions. When you want to pass an input into these functions, when you wanted to pass as an input to these functions, or these functions are spitting out an output, whether you wanted to give an input to these functions or these functions are giving out, okay, or giving out some output, that will be typically in the parameters. You want to give as an input, you cannot give an integer variable as an input to the SAP LR functions or the web functions. Okay, so you have to give an input value, you have to give it in a form of parameters, and these SAP GUI functions or web functions are spitting out some value, it will be typically into the LR parameter. So this SAP LR or web LR functions or SAP LR functions, okay, they don't deal with variables, they deal with, in other words, they don't deal with variables, they deal with parameters. So that's the reason why we need a concept called parameters. When we are talking about web functions, let's say web submit data, okay, and you want to pass some information into this web submit data, you cannot pass an integer variable inside it. Only the LR parameter you can provide as an input to it. Okay, LR parameters you can provide as an input to it. Okay, so you cannot provide an integer variable as an input to it. you have to provide an you have to provide an LR parameter as an input to it. Same with the SAP GUI LR functions. Okay, so you want to pass something to these SAP functions, SAP LR functions or SAP LR APIs, you have to pass it from the LR parameters, but not from integers, or not from the variables. In simple words, not from any of these variables. So that is the reason why you need a concept called parameters. So Kumar, all is good, okay, but still I didn't get the 100% clarity as to what you're saying. It is so confusing when you talk about this. Okay, so I totally agree with you. If it is still confusing, don't worry. The next videos, whatever I will be covering, okay, probably like 10 to 15 videos from now, it's all about LR parameters and how we use these LR parameters. So definitely, if you didn't understood now, 100% you will understand it while we are using it. Okay, again, while we are using it, I'll clearly mention that you cannot use an LR variable as variable as an input, parameter as an input, and clearly explain that to you time and again in every single place that I use it. Okay, but for now, just assume, in case if you didn't understood whatever the explanation I've given you from the last 5-10 minutes, just assume that there is a concept called LR parameters which is required. This is something that I wanted you to understand. Good. Then what kind of values that you can store in these LR parameters? As I've told you, you can store an integer or string or a boolean, decimal, float, any values you can store it in the LR parameters. Or in other words, any type of data, irrespective of whatever the type of data, you can store inside that. So for that, I'll show that on the PPT so that you will be totally clearly understanding it. Okay, so let's say there is a parameter called I, and we call this as a LR parameter. Some people just call this as a parameter. Just like a variable have a name, an LR parameter will have a name as well. Let's assume the name is I. But we know that we have done a little bit of programming, so we know that we have to give some meaningful names to the variables or parameters. So, but for now, since in the slide it is there, so let's go with I, but you have to typically give a meaningful name to the LR parameter. Let's assume it is I. You have the capability to store 1, which is an integer. You have the capability to store mark, which is a string, and you have the capability to store 10.25, which is a float. You can store any kind of value or any type of data into this LR parameter. Okay, so now the LR parameter is established, the concept called LR parameter. Again, I have been telling you that in the real world, when people who are doing LoadRunner, they call this as LR parameters, but wherever in the tool, wherever you are referring, they don't specifically call it as LR parameter. They just call it as parameters. They just call it as parameters in the tool wherever we are referring. Again, I will show that as well. In fact, when we have done the parameterization, okay, we have already seen that. We have done the parameterization. You see clearly here, nowhere it is saying LR parameter, it's just saying parameters. So this is basically an LR parameter. So there are multiple ways where I'll show you. There are other ways wherein you have the reference for these LR parameters. They don't specifically call it as LR parameters. They just call it as parameters. Okay. So coming back to the slides. So it has the capability to store any type of data which we have seen. Okay. So now you have the integer here. Okay. Let's say this is an integer. Just I'm drawing an analogy, guys. If this is confusing you, you can just totally ignore. But there are certain people who can understand if I draw some analogy to certain things. So I'm drawing this analogy to a cup. So let's say the cup is an integer wherein you have the contents of it. Definitely an integer variable. You have a contents of it like 1 or 100 or 10,000. Okay. So for a variable, you have the contents of it. So let's say these are the values which are there in this integer variable. Typically, just like you have the cup, the contents, you have some contents in the cup. And then let's say this is a string. Okay, you have the contents here in the cup. You have the tea or a coffee. But to a string, you would have some value like LoadRunner, or this is LoadRunner session, or whatever it is. Okay, and let's say this is an LR parameter. Okay, you can pour, or you can, whatever the value which is there in integer, you can put that into this LR parameter. That is what I'm trying to do. Just like the contents of the cup, you can pour that into this mug. You can put whatever the value which is there in this integer, maybe a 1 or 100 or 1000, you can put that into this LR parameter, and the contents of this string can be poured into this LR parameter as well. Okay, just like you can pour the coffee into this mug, the contents of this string, let's say this is LR session is there, that you can put that into the LR parameter, and vice versa is also possible. There is some value in the LR parameter, you can put that into an integer, and there is some value in the LR parameter, you can put that into a string. That is also a possibility. So what I am trying to tell you is converting a value from an integer to LR parameter is possible, and LR parameter to integer is possible. Similarly, converting a value from the LR parameter to string is possible, from the string to LR parameter is possible. Just like pouring the contents of a jug, pouring the contents of the cup into the jug, and pouring the contents of the cup into the jug is possible. This is also possible. That is the point that I am trying to say. Just you see, just like pouring the contents of one utensils to other is possible, just like that, similarly copying the values belonging to one data type, let's say integer, to the LR parameter is possible. You see, in the integer, let's say this integer is I. Let's say this integer is I, okay, and you have 100 inside that. You can convert that, or you can put that into this LR parameter 100. Let's say the LR parameter is P. Okay, so I is an integer variable, and you have 100 inside that. So putting that 100 into this parameter called P is possible. Similarly, you have a string. Let's say this is sbuff. This is sbuff. The string variable name is sbuff, and you have the value. This is LoadRunner session into it. You can put that value into this LR parameter as well. You can put that value into this LR parameter as well. Okay, and vice versa is also possible. You have a 1, you can put that into an integer, or you have LoadRunner session, LR session inside this parameter called P. You can put that into this string. Vice versa is also possible. This is what the conversions that I am talking about. This is what the conversions I am talking about. Okay, so converting from one data type to LR parameters, and LR parameters to a data type is possible, or variables to parameters, parameters to variables is possible. The variable could be an integer, or a string, or a float. Okay, so what I am saying is, converting from the variables to the parameters and parameters to the variables is possible. The variables could be of different data type. It could be an integer, or it could be a string, or it could be a float. Okay, in the next video I will show you how to convert from one to another. We will see that clearly in the next video.